Under siege. The death toll mounts as Russian forces push further into Ukraine. Slapping on sanctions. Taiwan joins international condemnation of Russia. Outperforming. Despite the pandemic, Taiwan's economy is on the upswing. But is everyone benefiting? And as we reach the anniversary of one of Taiwan's darkest days, we speak to those whose lives were affected by the 228 incident. A warm welcome to TaiwanPlus News. I'm Yin Khvat. The death toll mounts as Russia's invasion of Ukraine enters a second day. A Ukrainian official said that a Russian aircraft has been shot down over Kyiv, with more explosions in the capital reported overnight. Leaders from around the world have condemned Russia's actions, unveiling a host of targeted sanctions. But on the ground, the impact on the people of Ukraine is already evident. James Chater reports.
Explosions pierced the night sky above Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city. Over 100 Ukrainians are known to have died on the first day of Russia's invasion, with hundreds more injured, in what the US military is now calling the most serious conflict in Europe since World War II. Russia has launched missile attacks on locations across Ukraine, with troops pushing into the country from the north, east, and south. With his country under assault, Ukraine's president remained defiant.
А ми не боїмось. Ми не боїмось нічого. Не боїмось, захищаючи нашу державу. Ми не боїмось Росії. Ми не боїмось говорити з Росією.
As reports emerged that Russian soldiers were approaching Ukraine's capital, residents of Kyiv huddled down for the night in underground metro stations.
Потому что, как мне кажется, это один из единственных мест, где можно спрятаться сегодня в Киеве. А во всех остальных местах страшно.
As Russian troops and artillery pour into Ukraine, global leaders announced sanctions on Moscow, including from Taiwan, the EU, and the US. In Washington, US President Joe Biden condemned what he called a war without cause.
This was never about a genuine security concerns on their part. It was always about naked aggression, about Putin's desire for empire by any means necessary.
But as the sanctions pile up on Moscow, Putin attempted once more to justify the invasion.
То, что происходит, вынужденная мера. Ну, просто не оставили никаких шансов поступить иначе. Риски в сфере безопасности создали такие, что другими средствами отреагировать было невозможно.
But with this war just one day old, the human cost is already clear. In the Ukrainian city of Mariupol in Donetsk, children struggle to comprehend what is happening.
Я не хочу, чтобы я умирала. Хочу, чтобы быстрее это все закончилось.
Asnaya Joe and James Chater for TaiwanPlus.
Tens of thousands are fleeing Ukraine and have started arriving in neighbouring countries in Central Europe. Some Taiwanese are still stuck in the country, which is now at war. Taiwan doesn't have a representative office in Ukraine, and Taiwan's foreign ministry says that from Friday, Taiwanese living in Ukraine can deal with its office in Poland rather than Moscow. Louise Watt has this report.
Leaving Ukraine behind them, families seek safety in other European countries after Russia invaded their homeland by land, air and sea. At a border crossing with Poland, Ukrainians spoke of their shock.
Feeling when at the middle of the night you are awake because everybody calls you that the bomb fell and there is fires everywhere and different places, even such were supposed not to be bombed, even Western Ukraine, right?
As the scale of Russia's attack became clear, Ukrainians piled into cars and trains to flee, causing traffic jams like on this road from Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, where reports said apartment buildings were shaking from constant blasts. Flights soon diverted around Ukraine, the country closing its airspace to civilian flights because of what it said was a high risk to safety. Packed trains arrived in Poland.
Everyone was leaving Ukraine because of the bombing and everything.
But many more remain in Ukraine, including Hong Jia-cheng. He's one of 33 Taiwanese in the country. He wants to go home, but his Ukrainian wife doesn't have a Taiwanese visa, and they have yet to get a marriage certificate from Ukrainian authorities.
有签证上的问题，再加上肺炎，就是 COVID-19 的检测这些，所以会有很多麻烦的手续要做。那我个人的打算就是，如果波兰可以去就去波兰，如果波兰不能去，我会继续往西南方的山区移动。
Ukraine's neighbors are preparing for an influx of refugees and setting up camps. The Russian invasion could lead to a humanitarian crisis that crosses borders. Klein Wong and Louise Watt for TaiwanPlus.
With Ukraine battling to resist a full-out invasion, I asked Eric Lee, Associate Director of Programs with the US-based Project 2049 Institute, how closely Taiwan should be watching the developments.
I think what's happening in Ukraine is terrible. And for people in Taiwan, it's natural and understandable to draw parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan. You know, both are countries that are not part of security collectives. They face existential threats posed by much larger and hostile and irredentist neighbors. But it's important to keep in mind that these are fundamentally different situations. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. That said, what Taiwan should be looking at, and also China, are two main things. What the US is reacting to, how it reacts, as well as how the fight plays out. And a big thing to keep in mind is that with Russia, they are using a similar playbook that China could use if it decides to attack Taiwan. You know, not just invasion, but all on the spectrum of coercion. And this includes political warfare campaigns, cyber attacks, and missile strikes that may come before an amphibious invasion in Taiwan's situation.
What changes might Ukraine bring to the US-Taiwan relationship?
The situation in Ukraine should be a wake-up call for the US and Taiwan, because unlike Ukraine, Taiwan's relationship with great powers, they're all unofficial, and not a single country has a formal defense commitment to Taiwan. And a lot of these efforts, if there were to be a Taiwan contingency, would be US-led. Therefore, there must be a strengthening of defense relations between the US and Taiwan, and that begins with having a common language. Since the overall defense concept was put to the side, no one knows what Taiwan's defense strategy is anymore, including procurement priorities and reserve reform. It would be in the interests of both sides, the United States and Taiwan, to have some semblance of strategic clarity, whether publicly or privately, so that roles and responsibilities can begin to be established. And that includes for the invasion scenario and all of the spectrum of coercion.
In terms of priorities for Taiwan's defense, what would you place at the top?
I think the most important thing for Taiwan at this point is not any specific weapon system, but to have a clearly defined defense strategy, or at least concept, to describe the force buildup, its priorities, and reserve reform. I believe these are things that the US is looking at, and not just for US interests, but also how Taiwan would effectively build up an asymmetric force against China. Because the PLA has a growing qualitative and quantitative advantage, Taiwan must focus on certain areas. However, the US has been ambiguous with its support for Taiwan in the defense side. So Taiwan must be prepared for all scenarios.
Taiwan's government has announced it will impose sanctions on Russia over the invasion of Ukraine.
我们期盼各方尽速恢复和平对话，理性解决争端。而台湾作为国际社会的一员，对于有助于和平解决争议的努力，我们都愿意参与。台湾也会加入国际社会对俄罗斯的经济制裁。
According to government statistics, Russia is Taiwan's 19th largest trading partner, accounting for around 1% of total trade. The sanctions are unlikely to affect Taiwan's semiconductor industry, as chip sales to Russia total only 0.013% of the nation's exports. People are gathering in support of Ukraine outside Russia's representative office in Taipei. A small police presence monitored the rally from inside and outside the building. More protests are scheduled for later in the day. Taiwan is home to around 210 Ukrainian citizens. The event was organized by Alex Komakenko, who was born and grew up in Ukraine.
And so, yeah, it's unbelievable, right? It's the country where some of my family lives. It's the country that my Ukrainian grandfather fought for in World War II. He lived in Russia. And thankfully, in some way, he didn't live to see this day. If he did, it would just blow his mind that a fratricidal war is happening. People are, they're afraid, but they're not scared. They are taking measures. Some of them evacuated the big city. Some of them are staying down. But everybody is just there. They have nowhere to go, really. And they know that the country will fight, and they know that they will win.
A Russian human rights group says that more than 1,700 people have been detained in protests within Russia against the country's invasion of Ukraine. Crowds of demonstrators gathered in around 50 Russian cities, chanting "No to war" and carrying placards with anti-war messages. Some carried signs criticizing President Vladimir Putin, who ordered the invasion of Ukraine in the early hours of Thursday. Police took many protesters into custody, loading them into waiting vans and buses. The demonstrations are unlikely to sway the Kremlin, but they show that support within Russia for the military action in Ukraine is far from universal. Coming up, we take a look at how a living legend of Taiwanese opera is passing the mantle to the next generation of stars. Details after the break.
1947年228事件中，台湾人被迫害、被屠杀。但是台中嘛有一群青年组成武装27部队，勇敢徛出对抗不义的政府。当年27部队部队长张永仁，竟被队长吴金岛突击队长陈明忠以及食雪红的子弟兵蔡碧芬、陈英贤，70几年后现身说法。请大家来观看武装台中纪录片，见证台湾人这段恐怖的历史。
Welcome back. You're watching TaiwanPlus News. Let's take a look at some of the other stories in the region. Taiwan's United Microelectronics Corporation has announced plans for a $5 billion advanced semiconductor foundry in Singapore. The contract chip maker said the new fab will make 22 and 28 nanometer chips for 5G products, Internet of Things and auto electronics. It expects to begin production in late 2024. A global chip shortage made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic has particularly affected automakers and consumer electronics companies. UMC says it hopes the new Singapore facility will help restore balance to the industry's supply chain. It has been producing semiconductors in Singapore for more than 20 years. Taiwan's economy is expected to grow faster this year than the government initially forecast. The country's Statistics Office estimates that gross domestic product, or GDP, for 2022 will be 4.42%, up nearly 0.3 percentage points from the previous estimate in November. Figures also show that unemployment dropped for a 7th straight month in January. Earlier, reporter Eric Gao spoke with Dr. Roy Lee, Senior Deputy Executive Director at the Zhonghua Institution of Economic Research, and asked him what these numbers mean for Taiwan's overall economy.
First of all, the last quarter of last year, Taiwan performed much better than originally expected. Our export continued to grow for the 3 months of the last quarter, and the international demand for Taiwan's export items continue to remain strong. The demand for Taiwan's products, not only semiconductors, but also petrochemical, organic chemicals, or steel products and metal products, machineries, remain very strong.
As you mentioned, a lot of the growth is being driven by exporters, specifically semiconductors and raw materials and things like that. Does this mean that because these portions of the economy are doing so well that they're masking other parts of the economy that may not be doing quite as well?
According to our surveys among our manufacturer sectors, we do feel a sense of concern that's been growing in other sectors outside semiconductors. Their first concern comes from the fact that they have difficulty recruiting qualified workers to join because the expansion of semiconductors actually is a kind of taking away or becoming a magnet to attract qualified graduates. We also hear complaints from other sectors the shortage of supply of, for example, construction materials or construction companies that is willing to work with non-semiconductor companies because semiconductors tends to pay higher money and other providing better resources.
So despite all these rosy figures that we're getting from the government on unemployment and overall GDP growth, there are a few figures that aren't as good. Inflation keeps going up, especially in the last few quarters. Furlough numbers are still going up now and are fairly stubborn. So is this economic growth actually being felt by the average worker here in Taiwan?
Despite the fact that a lot of people are feeling a price increase in our daily lives, but the generalized figure growth rate is actually slower than many of the Western major countries. It is actually a good opportunity for Taiwan to actually increase our wages level. But if you look at the numbers, the wage growth rate is actually slower than the inflation rate. So I think the one key initiation is how can we keep the wage growth at the same level of the inflation rate. The second initiation is actually to make distribution of income more fair across the board among different segments of the society.
Taiwan's Transportation Ministry says deaths from drunk driving were at their highest in 5 years in 2021. There were 318 deaths, a 10% increase on the year before. Despite the spike, 2021 saw fewer overall deaths on Taiwan's roads than any of the previous 5 years. Transportation Minister Wang Guotai said fighting drunk driving will be a priority this year and issued a stern warning to would-be offenders.
这些酒驾有这些，我再次的讲，如果你在酒驾，就会让你吃牢饭。
Hong Kong has given emergency authorization for Chinese medical workers from outside of the territory to treat patients amid its worst ever wave of COVID-19 infections. In a statement, the government said Hong Kong is facing a dire epidemic situation which continues to deteriorate rapidly. Medics from China are not usually allowed to practice in Hong Kong without passing local exams and licensing requirements. But hospitals have been overwhelmed with nearly 50,000 cases reported in the past 2 weeks. Meanwhile, Hong Kong's new vaccine pass has gone into effect. It requires people aged 12 and above to have at least one COVID-19 jab to enter shopping malls, restaurants and public venues. However, not all support the prevention measure.
其實我覺得選唔選擇去用呢樣嘢係，我覺得係一個自由嚟㗎嘛，你唔可以逼人哋用。咁同埋 even 就算我唔打疫苗，其實我都應該可以去食嘢咯。咁所以我一定會係揀翻外賣咯而家。
The award-winning documentary about the 2019 Hong Kong protests, Revolution of Our Times, premieres in Taiwanese cinemas today. The film was first unveiled at the 2021 Cannes Film Festival. It was produced by Secret by director Kiwi Chow and an anonymous film crew credited simply as Hong Kongers. It later went on to win the Golden Horse Award for Best Documentary and sold out screenings around the world. Over its 2.5-hour runtime, the film follows a diverse cast of Hong Kongers who took part in the pro-democracy protests that captured global attention in 2019 and 2020. The film has been banned in Hong Kong, and its creators run the risk of violating the wide-ranging national security law. And on Thursday, the film's official YouTube channel was suspended for a few hours. February 28th is Peace Memorial Day in Taiwan to commemorate the 228 incident, an anti-government uprising in 1947 that left tens of thousands of people dead. One of them was Pan Mu-zi, a doctor who was executed under suspicion of working against the ruling party. Bing Wang spoke to his son, who tells us how 228 left an indelible mark on his family.
80-year-old Pan Qingqing honors his late father with a prayer. It's a ritual he performs every time he opens this box. Inside are the clothes his father Pan Mu-zi was wearing when he was executed. The holes in the ragged shirt are still visible 75 years later. Pan Qingqing was just 5 years old when his father was killed. He wasn't at the scene himself, but two of his older brothers were, and they told him every detail.
我的三哥啊，就去抱着他，去抱着他，因为那个整个脸都已经变形了，那个下巴有掉下来。我哥哥把他推上去，然后眼睛给他这样闭起来。
In what's become known as the 228 incident, the ruling Kuomintang, or KMT, brutally suppressed anti-government uprisings across Taiwan, killing tens of thousands of people in just a few weeks. Pan Mu-zi was a respected doctor in the southwestern city of Jiayi. A philanthropist, Pan didn't charge much for poor patients. He even treated soldiers free of charge.
我父亲对一般的病人是非常的好，非常的好。对这些所谓中国来的这些占领军呢，他都一视同仁。他为他们做这些事情，结果他们把我爸爸抓去枪决掉。
The ruling KMT suspected Pan of anti-government sentiments. They jailed and tortured him for 3 weeks, then shot him in front of the local train station. While in jail, he wrote letters to his wife on whatever material he could find. His last message to her, written on the inside of a cigarette box. I hope you will forgive me, for I am still with you every day and every night to protect you. The family should respect themselves, do not give up on themselves, and I pray again to take care of their health. But it wasn't the brothers' physical well-being that suffered. The father's death took a toll on their mental health, which they didn't speak about for decades. The KMT imposed martial law in 1949, and any mention of the 228 incident could get people thrown in jail.
突然他有一天打电话给我，他说：“坤尼哦，我那个有忧郁症。”我怎么会有忧郁症呢？看见你非常的健康，回来身体比我还好。他说：“我今年比去年还厉害。”我说奇怪啊，你去年你就有啦，就有忧郁症。他说：“不是啦，我一生啊都是跟忧郁症在那里奋斗的。”
Pan Qingqing didn't realize they weren't the only family to suffer such a loss until 40 years later when martial law was lifted.
我以为228只有我爸爸那几个人而已，那你们就可以想象，那时候封闭到什么程度。
For Taiwan's younger generations, 228 is a distant event they learn about in history books. But for numerous families like Pan's, who were forced to repress their experiences for decades, the so-called incident has left lasting repercussions. As Naya Zhou and Bing Wang for TaiwanPlus.
A legend of Taiwanese opera is in the spotlight once more as she passes the torch to one of her former pupils in a new production. Eric Gao takes a look at Lord Jiaqing and the journey to Taiwan.
Yang Lihua is considered a national treasure in Taiwan. Now 77 years old, she has been performing Taiwanese opera for more than 4 decades and has appeared in almost 170 productions. Now she is working on a new production, Lord Jiaqing and the Journey to Taiwan, and passing the generational mantle to one of her former apprentices. The production is based on a local folktale about a visit to Taiwan by the Qing Emperor Jiaqing. Yang served as artistic director, including designing the performers' costumes.
装饰品还有我的腰带，这个，然后包括我的朝珠，还有前后后全部都是他精心为我设计的。
Yang has called it her life's mission to pass on Taiwanese opera and preserve its unique character. But she also says change is necessary. Lord Jiaqing and the Journey to Taiwan will be televised, part of efforts to bring the art form to a wider audience. The show will hopefully create a new generation of Taiwanese opera fans. Kama Xu and Eric Gao for TaiwanPlus.
Thanks for watching TaiwanPlus News. Stay safe and see you next time.